Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining. You're joining the webinar hosted by the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy about the new power plant carbon rules in the Southeast. My name is Chris Carnevale. I'm the Climate Advocacy Director for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Let me go over our agenda for today. So first, we're going to have an introduction by Southern Alliance for Clean Energy Executive Director, Dr. Stephen Smith. Then we're going to be joined by our guest presenter, Carrie Jenks, who is the Executive Director of the Environmental and Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School. And Carrie is going to give us an overview of the new power plant carbon rules, generally speaking, nationally speaking. Then we're going to be joined by Southern Alliance for Clean Energy Research Director, Maggie Schober, who is going to give the context about how the rules may impact the Southeast and what's going on with some of the major power utilities in the Southeast. And then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. A few notes on housekeeping here for you. We are recording the presentation and we will email you a copy of the recording. It will be posted to our YouTube channel. We do have time for Q&A at the end of the presentations. And so if you have a question, please enter it into the Q&A box on Zoom. And if you are a reporter, please enter the name of your publication that you're affiliated with in the question, and we will try to prioritize questions from reporters to make sure you get the info you need. And we're running this program for an hour, so we will be ending at 2 o'clock Eastern or 1 o'clock Central, and we'll work to get through as many questions as we can in our time together. So as I mentioned, this webinar is being hosted by the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, or SACE for short. SACE is a nonprofit organization that advocates for responsible and equitable energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. As a leading voice for energy policy in our region, SACE is focused on transforming the way we produce and consume energy in the Southeast. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to SACE's Executive Director, Dr. Stephen Smith.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thanks everyone for joining. This is quite literally one of the most important webinars we've done in a while, because what we're seeing in the Southeast is an unprecedented surge of fossil fuel generation assets that are being proposed across our region. And there were a number of things that we were hoping would happen with utilities by providing them incentives and encouraging them to do the right thing relative to the climate crisis and the climate disruption that we're experiencing. But unfortunately, they're doing some of that, but they're tending to stick with fossil generation. And what that is ultimately going to require is that besides incentives, we're going to have a stick. We're going to have some sort of mechanism that forces the utilities to make the tough decisions to move past a heavy dependency on fossil assets that are the primary driver for the climate crisis. And as many of you know, right now we effectively do not have any regulation that is really limiting the amount of carbon that the utility sector is putting into the atmosphere. The Obama administration moved forward with the Clean Power Plan, but it was stayed by the court system. And so now the Biden administration has put together this plan that we'll hear Carrie get into the details of, that actually tries to take some of the lessons learned and continue to evolve the concepts of how EPA can regulate and use that stick. So this is a very important topic. We appreciate you joining. I'm not going to take any more time because there's a lot to present here and we want to get into Q&A. So I want to, again, thanks Carrie and Maggie for leading us through this discussion. Thank you very much.
So now I'll go ahead and introduce Carrie. So Carrie Jenks is the Executive Director of the Environmental and Energy Law Program at Harvard Law School. She leads the EELP team to identify legally durable strategies to support climate and environmental policies and advance clean energy deployment. With her legal and policy expertise in climate and environmental law, she's worked to build strategic alliances among stakeholders to advance policy solutions. Prior to the EELP, Carrie was an executive vice president at MJ Bradley and Associates, where she directed power company coalitions that have played a critical role supporting and defending in court air pollution and climate regulations. Before that, Carrie was an associate at Goodwin, Procter, and Bulkey, Farr and Gallagher. She received her JD from Georgetown University Law Center and BA from Harvard University. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie.
Okay. Great. Thanks so much for having me. Let me just share. So what I thought I would do is go through a little bit of background on the Clean Air Act, and then walk through what EPA has finalized for the power sector, and what it means for some states, because the existing gas standards require the states to develop plans, but then really look forward to the Q&A. So just backing up, there's a lot of acronyms in the Clean Air Act, and under this section of the Clean Air Act, Section 111, we talk a lot about Best System of Emission Reduction, or BSER. And generally, BSER, I sort of think of three components to it. It's what is adequately demonstrated, so what technologies are adequately demonstrated. EPA also needs to consider the energy and environmental impacts of any performance standard that they set, and they have to consider cost. And what's different in terms of what EPA had for considerations is that EPA needed to justify what technologies were adequately demonstrated, but they also had the Inflation Reduction Act, which really dramatically changed the cost considerations for what EPA was considering. The backtrack to all of this, though, was the Supreme Court case that was heard in 2021, and the court, they agreed to hear it in 2021, and they issued the opinion which told the EPA that they couldn't do generation shifting, which was the Clean Power Plan. And that was really shifting from EPA set a standard based on the shift they expected to happen in the electric grid between coal plants, natural gas plants, and renewables. And the court said that that was a major question, and EPA didn't have the authority to consider how the grid interacted across states and within states. Rather, EPA needed to set standards based on the unit. And so the court articulated what was a major question, and they said that EPA had claimed to discover a long extant statute in an unheralded power representing a transformative expansion of its regulatory authority. So EPA has gone back from this opinion and really thought through how they could design more of a traditional sort of performance-based standard. And so what EPA finalized in the past week or so was 4 components to this final rule. They finalized existing standards for fossil fuel steam generating units. And that's where they set standards for existing coal-fired boilers that are operating in the long term and medium term. And they also set standards for natural gas and oil-fired boilers. They also set standards for new reconstructed combustion turbines. And they set standards that are really consistent with the coal standards that are new and modified fossil units. And they had to repeal the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which is the Trump administration's final standards. So there were 4 sections of this rule. What they didn't do is they did not have anything finalized for existing natural gas fired power plants. And EPA has opened up a non-regulatory docket to take comment and to think through how to design that rule. I will also say they also finalized other rules that will affect the coal sector, which we can answer Q&A, but I won't get into details related to the mercury and air toxic standard, effluent limitation guidelines under the Clean Water Act, and then the coal combustion residual rule, which is under RCRA, another statute. So they released a series of rules that will have different timings and different statutory obligations. But for today, I'll focus on the existing coal-fired power plant rule and the finalized new gas-fired power plant rule. So starting with the coal-fired standards, they set BSER based on CCS, and they have 1 additional subcategory for that. And for each, I'll try to explain what changed from proposal into the final rule. So one change was that they made this rule simpler. They only have 2 subcategories now. Before they had multiple subcategories based on retirement dates. And for units that plan to operate farther into the future, beyond 2039, they set the BSER based on CCS, and that's consistent with what they had proposed. What they did change, though, is they changed the date of compliance from 2030 to 2032. So for units operating beyond 2039, they need to meet an emission rate that's based on an 88.4% emission reduction. For units that are going to retire by 2039, though, they had proposed it by 2040 and they changed it to 2039. So for units by 2039, those units need to meet an emission rate that's based on co-firing with natural gas, which gets you to a 16% emission rate reduction, thereabouts. And that compliance date is by 2030. For units that are retiring by 2032, though, this change from the proposal, they're exempting those units. So those units are not subject to this rule. States, though, do need to include those units in their plan, and they need to make sure that it's federally enforceable that those units do retire, but the units themselves aren't subject to the rule. So generally, if you're a baseload unit that's operating farther into the future, they do need to meet an emission rate by 2032 that's based on CCS. If you're retiring by 2039, it's a less stringent standard of co-firing, and then units retiring by 2032 are not subject to the rule. So those are the sort of the buckets of different subcategories. For the final new gas standards, there are 3 subcategories. Again, I think they made this simpler. There were different proposals based on whether you wanted to co-fire with high blends of hydrogen or intermediate. And so here they've said there's only a phase 2 for units that are going to operate as baseload, and there's only 1 BSCR. So they've said if you're constructing a new unit, you need to base that unit based on meet an emission rate based on CCS. So again, 90% capture rate. And they had proposed that you had to meet that rate by 2035. In the final rule, they shifted that to 2032. So that shifted earlier. But again, it's just that 1 BSCR, there's no hydrogen option. As I'll say though, at the end though, any unit can meet this rate however they choose. So it's an emission rate based on CCS, but if a unit wanted to do a high amount of hydrogen, they could do that they could meet that emission rate with hydrogen if they wanted to as well. What the other change was that they changed the capacity. They changed how much capture is defined as baseload. And so it's a 40% capacity factor, meaning the unit's operating about 40% of the time of the year. So they broadened out that baseload definition in this final rule. For units that are in the intermediate category, so operating between 20 to 40% capacity factor, they said they had originally proposed an emission rate based on 30% hydrogen co-firing, and they've made that less stringent by saying, no, you just need to be constructed and operated consistent with an efficient combustion turbine. So there's no phase 2 obligation to co-fire with hydrogen for the intermediate category. For peakers, they held that consistent with a 20% capacity factor. So that definition stayed the same. And they also held the standard the same to say you essentially just need to operate as you've been historically operating. So I think they've recognized that gas plants are going to play a different role as more renewables come on. And so they're asking companies to think through how are they going to operate and then meet an emission rate consistent with that. But again, as I mentioned, there's compliance flexibility. EPA sets the standard. They don't care which technology used to meet that standard as long as you meet that standard. So it's important to think through how companies might meet those standards. The other piece of the rule that I think is important that I want to highlight is there was a lot of discussion in the comments and from stakeholders about reliability. And so what happens if companies make investments to make CCS, but a permitting decision gets delayed, or they do plan to retire a unit, but they're needed for reliability because a renewable plant doesn't come online or a transmission line doesn't get built. And so EPA tried to think through what were their authorities and what did they have the ability to recognize that, to make sure that companies make investments and start to make progress. But if all good efforts, if something comes up that nobody planned, what are the options that EPA has to address that? So there were a couple of different options they put in there. For emergency situations where a unit is needed for reliability, they define those as energy emergency alerts that NERC has pre-definitions for. And they said if you're operating, if NERC decides that these emergency alerts have happened, the units can operate without operating their controls. So they could stop operating with CCS and just run for that emergency period. Existing units, states have the option to include that for coal plants. And if that was the case, you need to meet a historic emission rate. And if you're a new unit, EPA will exclude that period of time during that emergency period. So for those short windows where a unit might be needed, EPA made sure that those units could be operated. If an existing unit, though, is planning to retire, so a coal plant is planning to retire by either 2032 or 2039, those units could get an additional 1-year extension if the reliability authority decides that they are needed. And there's steps to make sure that those are credible and real, but there is an option for those units to continue to operate up to 1 additional year if they're needed. For units that are installing controls, states can either include or EPA can give an extension up to 1 additional year if it's a new unit, if there's delays demonstrated due to supply chain or something that happened really beyond the operator's control. So all best efforts have happened, but something has happened, they can get an extension in that case. In the case that they need more than 6 months, so between 6 months to a year, EPA said they're going to seek FERC's advice, though, if an extension is warranted, and just get that input from FERC. If an extension beyond a year is needed, then EPA is expecting for existing plants, states would have to revise their state plans. And so under the Clean Air Act, for the existing coal-fired power plant, states have to go through a process to determine the unit specific emission rate and think through the timing and what's required. And so a state would have to revise their plan if a unit says they need more than a year, and then EPA would need to approve that. The Clean Air Act also includes a provision about what's called remaining useful life and other factors, or RULOF. And states have the authority to apply RULOF if they determine that there's something fundamentally different than what EPA considered for the national standard. If a unit can't, for example, if there's unreasonable cost of control or some physical impossibility or technical infeasibility to meet what EPA considered for BSCR. So states still have that authority under 111. The Supreme Court recognized that in the West Virginia case, and EPA's included language to reaffirm that authority as well. Just going a little bit more into the state planning point, and this is my last slide, and then look forward to the discussion. So states have 24 months after the final rules are published to submit their plans, to go through the process of designing the plans and submitting them. So we're estimating that they're due in May of 2026. The key components of the plan for power plants for each unit, so this is just for existing coal-fired power plants at this time, states need to identify each affected facility and identify the standard of performance and reporting and monitoring requirements that are going to be used to determine compliance. They also have to set the compliance schedules and the increment of progress. So there are certain requirements to make sure they're getting the permits in place and making sure they're making progress to that compliance date of 2032. They also need to demonstrate that this emission standard is going to be quantifiable, verifiable, and enforceable. And then states need to make sure that they are, with all of the unit specific emission rates, that they're going to achieve an emission performance that's consistent with what EPA has set through these final rules. They also need to make sure they've got reporting and record keeping requirements to track the plan's performance. And they've also made sure that there's meaningful public engagement process so that the communities and stakeholders near these plants can decide what makes the most sense given all the other factors that are going into these considerations as they develop the state plan. And then finally, the states need to think through what are the different compliance flexibilities that they might want to allow, whether it's those reliability extensions that I mentioned, different trading options, averaging, or mass-based compliance option. And EPA has given some guidance to states, but it is going to be important for states to think through which compliance options make the most sense given their fleet and the different companies that they're operating with. But with that, I look forward to the Q&A, and I will turn it back to you, Chris.
Great, thank you, Carrie. So now I'll turn it over to Maggie Schober to talk about the context of how these rules may fit into the landscape of the Southeast. So Maggie is SACE's research director, and I'll turn it over to you, Maggie.
All right, thank you. All right, so that was a fantastic overview from Carrie, and now we're going to kind of dig into what does this mean for the Southeast? At least what do we, you know, what can we say today that this will probably mean for the Southeast? And Steve actually covered this, so I'm going to skip this little about SACE bit and talk a little bit. I'll start with coal and get into some of the gas pieces. So as Carrie mentioned, there's, you know, two parts of this. One's looking at more at coal and one's looking at new gas. So, you know, the first questions are what is the coal situation in the Southeast right now? There are just under 40 gigawatts of coal capacity approximately in the Southeast operating today. And about a third of that, or 13 gigawatts, is already set to retire by the end of 2032. So those are the plants that will, you know, they have a retirement date. They're already retiring before 2032. They won't have to, you know, necessarily change what they're doing. But about half of that 40 gigawatts, so 20 or so, do not have a retirement date set at all. at this point. And so those would fall into the category where, they would potentially be planned to operate past 2039. And so the utilities or the plant owners will have to look at, what to do with that plant, whether that is, some compliance mechanism or setting a retirement date, and then the remainder of the plants, so around 7 gigawatts or so, are in that middle category where they have retirement dates set before 2039, and so they're gonna need to look at those specific compliance mechanisms. And before we get into gas plants, just a little background on some terms I'm going to use that can seem pretty technical, but really help us understand this rule. So first, there are two types of gas plants. There's a lot of acronyms in the electricity sector, and these are two of the most commonly used. These are both fossil gas fired types of fossil gas fired power plants. These are the ones that utilities are or developers are proposing to build in the future. There are some older, other kinds of plants that are already on the system, but these are the two that utilities are planning to build. Combustion turbines, called CTs, usually called single or frame, they tend to be less expensive to build, but pretty expensive, per megawatt hour to run. They have higher emission rates of all kinds of emissions, and they're sometimes referred to as peakers because they run less. They're usually turned on for meeting peak load. The other category is a combined cycle, or CC. These are fairly efficient per megawatt hour because they have a way to use their waste heat to turn usually an additional turbine and sort of capture some of that waste heat and generate more megawatt hours that way. They are more expensive to build, but less expensive to run and have lower emission rates than the peakers. They can sometimes be called either base load or intermediate plants. So taking a look, since the EPA rule is talking about new gas plants, and we don't have data for those on the system yet because they're not built yet. I did look at some analysis. I wanted to pull out both the emission rate and the capacity factors for the existing coal, that 40 gigawatts of coal in the Southeast. What I've categorized here as newer combined cycles, or CCs, in the Southeast, and then the newer CTs. So by newer, I just mean it's been built in the last 10 years, so they're less than 10 years old. So as you can see, the emission factors, the first thing I want to say is that this is only CO2. If we're looking at greenhouse gases, these would actually be fairly different for the gas plants because fossil gas is primarily methane, CH4. It is also a carbon resource. It is also very much a greenhouse gas and a more potent greenhouse gas in the near term. And so just caveating that this is not apples to apples, when we're talking about greenhouse gases. But the existing coal fleet is right around that 2,300 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. CCs, again, lower emission rates than the CTs, 900 compared to 1,500 pounds per megawatt hour. The other piece that's really relevant from the perspective of these EPA regulations are how much are these units operating? So the Southeast coal units, while a lot of these used to be, really base load power plants, you kind of turn them on and leave them running because they take a few days to turn on and a few days to turn off. They're not very flexible. That's not the situation for our current electricity grid, and certainly not moving forward. So these coal plants are already being used at what's a 30% capacity factor. Let me pause real quick. I realize I'm using another industry term. Capacity factor is just a term for how much a power plant is running. So they're terms of percentages, so 0 to 100, and it's just typically in a year, so it's an annual capacity factor, how much of that plant's like total max capacity, was it running? So if it's 50% capacity factor, it could have been running at 50% capacity the entire year, or it could have been running 100% capacity for half of the year. So you kind of see how that gets worked out. So coal plants are at 30% capacity factor. Those newer Southeast CCs are used in that, seems like more in that base load category and somewhat intermediate. They're at that 60% capacity factor. I will say there's quite a bit of variation in there. So there are some new CCs in the Southeast that are used, have capacity factors of 80% or more, and are used very much as base load. And then the CTs, again, used as peakers. Right now, some of those newer units tend to be used around 15%. There's again some variation in there. Some of those capacity factors are actually much lower than that, depending on the unit. And so this is probably the slide I'll spend the most time on. I think it's kind of the most impactful. There's been a lot of talk among industry folks and just around the region about exactly how much proposed new gas there is in the Southeast in particular. This is a really big deal. There are more, there are larger proposed gas capacity additions in the Southeast than anywhere else in the country. The two utilities with the most planned gas are in the Southeast. And what I've done here is presented ranges where there's actually the potential for there to be even more planned gas on the system. So I'll walk you through this because it's a little bit of a funky slide or funky chart. And I'll go bottom to top. So at the bottom is TVA, and they have anywhere from about 5.1 gigawatts to over 8 gigawatts of gas planned on their system, a combination of CCs and CTs. So plants that would run, they would plan to run over that 40% capacity factor, and then some that probably would fall in that 20 to 40% range, and some that might fall in that range below 20%. Most of their planned gas is already named projects. They're already going through the NEPA process, since TVA doesn't have to go through a public service commission to get individual plants approved. They just have to go through the NEPA process, which is National Environmental Policy Act. I'm using more acronyms, I'm sorry. And most of those are set to go online between 2026 and 2028. That's TVA's current plan. Duke Energy, their two utilities in North and South Carolina, they have a plan in front of their commission that has even more gas planned to come online, although it's over a broader time frame, all the way out to 2033. They're proposing to their commission, they're asking their commission for permission to build up nearly 9 gigawatts of gas over that time frame. And again, that's a combination of CTs and CCs, although they are much more heavily skewed towards the CCs. And then Georgia Power just got approval from their Public Service Commission for an IRP that did include 1.3 gigawatts of CT projects. And so they're now moved on to the next step, asking for the next approval for that specific project. But there are also ranges presented here. So before a utility even presents a plan to its commission for approval, they have to enter those projects into their interconnection queue. And we've seen a lot of utility proposed gas entering the interconnection queue in the last couple of months, particularly Georgia Power. So the low end for their range is this 1.3 gigawatts. But there's an additional about 10 gigawatts in their queue, and they're set to submit a new draft IRP in January of 2025. So we will be absolutely on the lookout to see what that includes and how they treat this rule. And then there is also an additional 2.2 gigawatts in TVA's queue right now that we are waiting to see, when that project starts its NEPA process. So the thing I'll end on is kind of what I was alluding to there, which is there's a lot of moving parts in utility planning. So electric utilities, they're always going through some sort of long-term planning process, either internally or out there at their commission, because it is, the way the system works. There is a significant lead time for, any kind of generation project, demand side project. It's really important that utilities always be mapping out their load forecasts and what kinds of power plants they plan to build. Here is a snapshot of some of the major utilities in the Southeast and when those, sort of the next steps in those planning processes. And since these rules, there was a proposed rule last year. There's a final rule now. It's been, was it over 15 years, well over a decade since the Supreme Court said, yes, that greenhouse gases are a part of the Clean Air Act. And so, yes, you need to regulate these. So obviously, utilities had plenty of opportunity to see this coming. And now this needs to be a part of their planning process to ensure that they meet this regulation, just like they have to follow all the rest of the rules and regulations that apply to them. So some of these are going on right now, some are later this year, and some are into next year. And with that, that's the end of my slides, and I will stop sharing and we can turn over to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. All right, so we do have some questions that have come in already. However, if you have a question that you have not submitted yet, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A box, and we'll work to get to as many as we can. So, Steve, if you're available to come on video, feel free to come on if you'd like to answer any questions. So I'll start with a question from Will at PV Magazine. The question is, will EPA's power plant pollution rules crimp Southeast utilities plans for new fossil units? And if so, how? And so, Maggie, I think you'll probably be the best person to go first at that.
Yeah, I think the second part of that question, we're not entirely sure how, but I think the answer is yes to the first one. This rule, the Southeast has a significant number of planned new fossil gas plants, and those plants, any plant that comes online after May of 2023, which all of these plants fall into, will have to meet this regulation in one way or another. And so the utilities will have to account for that, whether that is changing which power plants they plan to build or just changing their plans for that power plant itself. For some of these compliance, mechanisms, that's up to the utility, and that's what they need to figure out through their integrated resource planning process.
Yeah, Chris, I would just add, we hope that the utilities will take this serious and they will act responsibly and do the right thing. But we all know that there's going to be some legal challenges, and, the utilities can irresponsibly bet on the fact that this may get challenged legally. So I think this is really up to the leadership of the companies to, because this rule, as was explained earlier, pretty has a lot of flexibility to it, and it gives them options. So we would hope that they will act accordingly and act responsibly.
As a follow-up question, I'm wondering, Maggie, if you could explain with the pipeline of gas projects that you just laid out in the Southeast, how were utilities and utility regulators contemplating or not contemplating these EPA rules as those proposals for those plants and projects have been made?
Yeah, I think it's been, it certainly hasn't been in any of the base cases that we have seen so far, even though, as we said, there's been a proposed rule. We've known that a rule of this, that looks something like this was coming and going to be implemented. I mean, it's been required since, you know, George W. Bush was president. This is not new stuff here. And so the utilities were still not putting it in their base case. As an example, Duke Energy filed thousands and thousands of pages for their carbon plan / IRP in both North and South Carolina. They did one sensitivity on the proposed rule, and the discussion of that took up about 3 or 4 pages in an appendix. So it's not a high priority for them to present to their commission that this is something that is, you know, going to impact their future plans, while at the same time they are proposing 9 gigawatts of new gas. Another example of that is with TVA, 2 of their combined cycles, they've proposed, one at the Cumberland site and one at the Kingston site, have higher capacity factors. In fact, the one at Cumberland, we understand when they did all their cost analysis to justify the plant, was operating at an 86% capacity factor. So that is obviously well into that top end category for new gas. And yet there's not been any discussion of ways that they could put CCS on that plant and what they would do with the carbon, you know, store it or transport it, or how they would deal with that. So there's a lot of really big questions for these utilities to consider. I wish they weren't, you know, scrambling at this point, but there's no reason for them to be scrambling. They knew what was coming. And so now we, you know, I'll just say what we are hearing. We are going to continue to hear from utilities that this is going to be very difficult to meet. And part of that is of their own making, because they could have seen this coming and planned for it in that way. I will also say that, you know, all the utilities are all doing their own modeling and their own discussions about how difficult this will be for reliability, which, by the way, they've said for like every environmental regulation for decades, and we still haven't seen that happen. The EPA also did their own modeling of this rule to make sure, you know, that there's not reliability issues. And so there's several pathways that the utilities can use, and the EPA has thought around all of these as they're crafting the rule, to have the flexibility and to have it be able to both stand up in front of the courts and be more sturdy in that way, if that's a right term, and also for the utilities to be able to implement it without you know, having reliability issues.
Okay. Our next question, Maggie, this is going to be for you. This is from Zachary Turner with WFAE. Do you have a figure handy for how much gas capacity Duke Energy currently has?
I'm not remembering that offhand, but I can follow up with him.
Okay, great. All right, related question from Elizabeth Oots. How do you think these new rules will impact Duke's carbon plan, integrated resource plan filing? And will it change cost calculations for ratepayers? Do you expect Duke to alter its modeling on its own, or will regulators have to order it to do so?
So there's not, so Duke's already submitted its modeling. In fact, it's submitted its modeling twice now. So they've already delayed the process once because Duke got its load forecast, had to increase its load forecast. So I doubt that either North or South Carolina commissions would really want to do another round of that at this point. Again, Duke did some scenarios, sensitivity analysis of the proposed rule on the modeling they did back in August. So that's before they adjusted their load forecast. So they don't have a scenario, that at least not one that I have seen, where they have implemented even the proposed rule on their new load forecast. I think this will absolutely come up in the process in front of the commission, in the testimony that's filed in both states and in the hearings. And I think it's up to the commission to really, both of the commissions to protect the ratepayers of that are in both states, by making sure that Duke is taking this seriously and they don't get caught, not having many options of these, these flexibility options available to them, and that Duke's not trying to do something like just build twice as much gas capacity and operate it half as much, because that would absolutely impact ratepayers. And so looking at, all the options in addition to the flexibility that's provided under the rule, having Duke put in more solar plus storage, more demand response, more energy efficiency, all of these sorts of things can then also help ease any sort of burden that Duke would have of complying with this rule.
Okay, we have a related question, which is that, and this was framed by Will at PV Magazine, but I think it's also helpful just generally. Do you expect that the costs of reducing fossil unit CO2 emissions may lead to higher renewables portfolios beating high fossil portfolios on a cost basis in forthcoming utility resource plans? And Carrie, let me see first if you have a reaction to that.
I think it adds, this will add different costs to building up gas plants. It also thinks through the timeline. So I think gas in any part of the country is projected to operate differently in the future. And so the question is, as commissions are thinking through, it's how long does that gas plant need to run, and how does it need to run, and can it recover as renewables? I do think there is a role for gas, whether it be new or existing, to support renewables. And so the question is, how can gas be operating differently in that new sort of the transition that the energy sector is undergoing, and what's the timeline for that? So I think renewables with the IRA bring down the cost of renewables, and the rule increasing the cost for gas to operate differently. That's how utilities and commissions need to think through, what does that future look like? I don't know, Maggie, if you want to add to that too.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. My sense is, I think it'll depend on case by case somewhat, but my sense is that I think that IRA is going to have a much bigger impact on these sort of cost comparisons than this rule. But I don't think this rule is, I think the impact will be non-zero for sure. So yes, I agree.
Okay, thank you. All right, this question is from Dave Flessner with the Chattanooga Times Free Press. What, if any, carbon capture or sequestration might be possible in the Southeast by these utilities to meet the new EPA carbon rules for gas plants? Will gas plants have to either limit or quit operations to meet the EPA rules over time? I guess those are kind of two questions, really. So yeah, let's start with the first one, which is what are the carbon capture and or sequestration or use options? What would they look like in the Southeast?
I can kind of start with some of that, if that's all right, and be interested in Carrie's take on especially the second part of the question. I think my sense is, so I mean, in the Southeast, we've seen utilities look at and propose CCS of different kinds, at various points, with varying success. But it's also, it's been something that, in my opinion, we get a little bit of utility double speak, where they will talk to their commissioners and say like, hey, let us build this gas plant because we're going to put CCS on it at some point. And now, they're saying to the EPA, wait a second, you're going to call our bluff on this. You're saying now we actually have to put CCS. You're going to put a time frame on it. There's no way we can, ever do this. That's what some utilities are saying. I'm not saying everyone, but I think I'll go back to the Duke Energy example, because Duke Energy filed comments to the EPA on the proposed rule in the same week that it filed its original carbon plan and IRP in North and South Carolina. And so, you could really compare and contrast them basically in the same moment, to see what they were saying to various different regulators, depending on, how they wanted to do that dance. So I think, I think that there's a possibility of, one or several CCS projects in the Southeast. I know there's been talked about possibilities of CCS and not storing it on site and having, pipelines. There are carbon dioxide pipelines out there. I think that, we, as, clean energy organization and environmental organization, we're going to look at these projects pretty closely, because they are, not without their own environmental impacts. And so that's going to really be a case by case basis. I haven't seen, since these rules came out, it's been a very short time, but I haven't seen any utilities announce specific proposals since then.
Yeah, let me.
And there's also a lot of incentives in IRA for CCS. So that is another piece that makes it, from a cost perspective, it really makes it a lot more feasible.
Yeah, I would just add to Dave's question that there's two big projects that have been undertaken over the past years. One, TECO, Tampa Electric, had their Polk facility, and they were playing around with the concept of CCS and everything, and it never really materialized, I think, is the way that they had envisioned it or wanted it to. And then Southern Company had an absolute financial disaster in northern Mississippi where they tried to have a CCS, and I think some people went to jail, and there was a bunch of problems, and the ratepayers kind of got blinked on it. And so, I would say that if you look at the actual tangible examples of where this has been applied in the Southeast, we don't have a very good track record.
Okay, so let's go to, I'm sorry.
For like the CCS standard for new gas is for new plants. So I think EPA is also thinking through that companies, as they build out plants and construct them, can keep that into consideration as they build them out. So that's another piece that I think is important to realize.
So then the second piece of the question is, will gas plants have to either limit or quit operations to meet the EPA rules over time? So yeah, this is gas plants, not coal plants. Will gas plants have to either limit or quit operations to meet the EPA rules over time?
So I mean, the option is for a gas plant to meet the different subcategories. If they choose that CCS is not what they want to do, then they can operate as an intermediate or a peaker. I think it will depend on what other projects and what the fleet looks like in that region, and the transmission opportunities as well.
Okay. Let's see. Next question. We can probably roll a couple questions together. We have a question from Lucinda Sonnenberg. This is probably best for either you, Steve, or Maggie. How will this rule have an impact on TVA's planned gas projects? And then we had another question on TVA's IRP. Let me pull it up here. This is from Regina Butler. Did the new emission regulations have anything to do with TVA pushing their IRP date back a few months? So let's put those together. TVA and the new standards and how that affects their planned gas projects and their IRP timeline. So let me turn that over to Maggie and Steve.
you want me to start, Steve?
Yeah, go ahead, Megan.
Okay. So yeah, it's absolutely going to impact TVA's planned gas plants because all of them are regulated under this scenario or under this regulation. You know exactly how, whether TVA decides to try and put CCS on some of them or operate them, you know, limit their operations or even cancel some of them altogether. We will see. I have heard that the timing of this rule was a part of TVA's decision to delay releasing its draft IRP. I have not heard that directly from TVA itself. They have not made an announcement around why exactly, you know, they delayed it, but that is one of the rumors swirling around. So it's a possibility, but I wouldn't, you know, I can't say for sure.
Yeah, I I would agree with Maggie that we don't have a clear signal yet from the leadership at TVA. If you go back in history, there have been times where TVA has very aggressively resisted regulations from the EPA and, you know, sort of taken a very hostile position. There have been other times, to TVA's credit, where they have actually led and responded favorably to EPA regulations, as you know, as part you would imagine, as part of the federal government and as part of the administration, that they would work in concert with the proposed rules. So I think that is still an open question. And it goes back to my sort of lead off comment on this. I think that utilities can either posture against this or they can work with it and embrace it and move forward. And again, I think that the rule's very new and we're not 100% sure where everybody's going to fall, but there's a lot of carbon emissions directly and then also methane, climate forcing emissions that are, you know, in the queue here. And this is a phenomenally important moment for making the right decision about whether we're going to, you know, prioritize minimizing climate disruption or whether we're going to, you know, take the status quo and, you know, just fight and resist and delay while every single day the amount of carbon in the atmosphere continues to go up. And it's accelerating, unfortunately.
Okay. Carrie, this is a question for you. Is there are there practical differences between the new gas standards for intermediate load and peaker plants? Your slides seem to indicate that they were kind of more or less, operate the plants efficiently.
Yeah, I think the CT rate, the intermediate load, is an efficient CT. So I think NGCC can meet those rates, but a combustion turbine that Maggie was explaining, I think it is an efficient one, a newer construction than an older CT. So I think there is a distinction in terms of the emission rates. I think my point was that most CTs that would be constructed new today, if you're buying it, the ones that you would buy would meet that emission rate in terms of what's being sold on the market. So remember, these are for new construction. So that's the difference. I think if we were talking about existing, the rates you saw that Maggie was showing are higher. So there's a difference there. But if you're operating as a peaker, you can pretty much operate as you're operating. And if you're a CT, I think it's not requiring you to do something that's probably not being constructed at the moment as well.
Okay. Carrie, this is probably a question for you, although probably everyone can chime in. This is from Jessica Sondergroth. Do you see this rule changing utility outlooks on nuclear power, currently viewed as a more long-term option, given gas has been viewed as the bridge to decarbonization targets?
I mean, I think companies as a whole, as they're decarbonizing, are thinking about what's most economical in terms of affordability and what they can construct, and where they are in terms of the politics and the communities that they're operating in. So nuclear there's incentives for nuclear as well to continue to operate existing plants in the IRA. And so I think all of those pieces are on the table. I think there is an opportunity to think through what's the role of nuclear or new nuclear and smaller modular reactors as well.
Yeah, I would chime in, the frame of fossil gas as a bridge was always largely interpreted as fossil gas as a bridge to the continued expansion of renewable energy. It wasn't really towards a bridge to bringing on a whole bunch of new nuclear power plants. I, a lot of people know SACE's position. We're skeptical on the cost effectiveness of new nuclear power plants. That has been dramatically borne out in both South Carolina and Georgia with their flirtation in South Carolina, flirtation towards failure, and then their, dramatic cost overruns associated with the Vogtle facilities in Georgia. As we look at this sort of siren call of small modular reactors, NuScale basically had a very large failure to launch, and we're continuing to see the price points going up on the projections for SMRs, and they're not in the money. And so, yeah, maybe, but I think that what's clearly missing in our region is the proper level of ambition for renewable deployment, renewable and storage deployment. It's just about every one of our utilities has a fairly robust portfolio of nuclear power, and so if you're going to have a diverse portfolio, we would like to see commitments from the utilities to getting their renewable portfolio on par with their nuclear portfolio, and then let's have a debate about what we do from there, as opposed to, delaying renewable deployment for the illusion that we're going to get cost-effective nuclear power in the near term.
Yeah, and let me just do a quick rundown of what some utilities have already been proposing in recent IRPs too around the Southeast. So Duke Energy's carbon plan IRP that I've mentioned before does have a fair amount of new nuclear. TVA is doing one SMR project already, with the potential for additional. We haven't seen their IRP yet, so we don't know if those, where those will show up. Georgia Power has not put any additional new nuclear in their latest IRP, but we'll see in January if they do. And then Florida Power and Light has the most aggressive change in decarbonization sort of trajectories through their Wheel Zero 2045 plan. And that is all solar and storage. And so far, they have not proposed any new nuclear to be a part of that. So those are the sort of where we're seeing buzz around potential new nuclear, and not hearing anything about it at the moment.
Okay, well, we are at time. We're at the end of the hour. Let me just ask, do any of you, Carrie, Maggie, or Steve, have any closing words that you want to share? Anything you wanted to circle back to? Okay.
I'll just go back and say, we ask that the utilities do the right thing. I think this is a good faith effort by a regulator to propose a rule that has a lot of flexibility, but also moves us very directly in the right direction. And, I just think it's high time that the utilities become part of the solution instead of part of the problem about climate change.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Carrie and Maggie and Steve, for the program today, and thank you everyone for joining and for asking your questions. As I mentioned, the webinar has been recorded, so everybody who registered will be emailed a link to the recording. And if you have any outstanding questions, please follow up with us. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. Bye.
Thank you.